Cyberpunk told the story of a man driven to death in the pursuit of greatness, and of a world cast deep into conspiracy and intrigue. But what if I told you it was only the beginning? For those of you that don't know, an iceberg is a deep dive into the strangest and craziest mysteries in the mediums we love, where the first tier is the more mundane and well-known theories, and the deeper we go, the more unbelievable the revelations become. So let's start out by looking at the first tier, and then slowly make our way into the craziest, darkest, and most disturbing conspiracies in all of Cyberpunk. Atom Smasher turned out to be a pretty weak villain in the game, but there is one really interesting interaction early on in the story that a lot of players may have missed on their first playthrough. When you're at Konpeki Plaza with Jackie stealing the data shard, at one point you're almost caught red-handed and have to hide inside Yorinobu's room while Saburo Arasaka and Atom Smasher themselves enter the room as well. On first glance, it seems like you narrowly avoided being detected, but upon further inspection, that may not be the case. You see, there's an cyberware mod called a threat detector that, when equipped, shows any enemies in the area that are aware of your presence and outlines them in red. And lo and behold, if you have this equipped during the cutscene, you can see Atom Smasher clearly outlined in red, staring right at you and Jackie. Could this mean Atom Smasher knew the whole time? Were you set up from the beginning? Did Atom know Saburo was about to be killed? This would have major ramifications on the story of the game. Or it could just be that all the bosses in the game have a script that allows them to see you at all times for gameplay purposes. But let's ignore that, because that's not fun. As we all know, Cyberpunk was initially released in a less than ideal state. But some might not know about the 4 gigs that were cut from the game but are still in the files. These 4 gigs are actually being updated by CD Projekt Red to this day and will likely be added in a future patch release, or at least with time. The first gig, and by far my favorite and the most interesting, is Desperate Measures and tells the story of Pedro, a corp and very proficient netrunner who is trying to take over an automated Zeta Tech transporter, so he enlists your help to get it done. But you see, that's not the intriguing part. Pedro is a good man, but as you talk to him more and notice he is sitting in a wheelchair, you ask and he confirms that he has ALS, which, for those of you who don't know, is one of the few diseases yet to be cured in the Cyberpunk universe. And as you can hear about on car radios from time to time, Pedro has found a black market dealer in the USSR that is willing to help him convert his mind into a new body for a fee, and Pedro needs to find the cash. The quest is super interesting because it touches on a lot of lore and backstory we don't hear about in the Cyberpunk universe, and it's a shame it's not in the base game as of recording this video. Next up, Concrete Cage Trap is about a man named Tiny Mike who's being chased down by Militech agents. He's hiding out in an abandoned apartment building, and after figuring out one of many ways inside, you have to help him sneak or shoot his way out. You get him out safely back to the car, and Regina thanks you for your time. It's a pretty cookie-cutter mission. The third gig, Hothead, tells the story of an NPC trapped by a Militech netrunner who has put a virus on their chip, allowing them to be traced constantly. You have to drive around the city defending your car from enemies while your assailant tries to get rid of the virus. Only thing is, no cars come to fight you and nothing actually happens. And that's because this quest probably stopped development after shooting cars in Cyberpunk was potentially removed as a feature and left in the game files only as a remnant for us to see to this day. And the final gig, Nasty Hangover, is a request from Rogue to break into a warehouse and find Carl Gainsky, who was out drunk, and got kidnapped by some Kang Tao operators because he has a chip in his head housing super confidential corpo secrets. So you break in and steal the chip and bring it back to Carl, and either watch him get taken out by the company operatives or help him to keep the chip. Another pretty straightforward and quick quest. So this one and the last one are less of a conspiracy and more so confirmed, but a lot of people might not know about this one specifically. There's a rare line of dialogue you can hear at one of the gay clubs in the game where Silverhand confirms that he has swung both ways in the past. It's not surprising coming from a famous rocker boy, but it's an interesting insight nonetheless. Here, take a listen for yourself.
Last time I was here, I was with Carrie. This Latino hunk gave us a lap dance. Cheeks so smooth, I could almost see my own reflection.
I thought you preferred girls.
Mostly. Now and then I swung both ways.
For those unfamiliar with space travel, a mass driver is essentially just a massive platform that helps spaceships launch into space or orbit from the ground. And buried deep in the game files is actually such a structure. And even more curiously, it fits precisely into the currently existing spaceport in the game. This mass driver is assumably cut content for traveling into space or will be used in future expansions where we will get to travel to the Crystal Palace in space as V and discover it as an all-new zone. Either way though, it's quite obvious that CD Projekt Red has put a lot more thought into space travel in this game than we may have initially thought. And I am already hoping this idea comes to fruition in the future, because it's probably one of the coolest places we could possibly go in the Cyberpunk universe. Next up, we have some more lesser known theories about Cyberpunk that need some further explaining. These aren't as disturbing as some on the list later on, but they are still scary in their own right and help dive into the lore and backstory of this game. Early on in the game, you are able to find a cat right outside of Victor's clinic that you're able to pet and be on your merry way. It's an interesting interaction, though specifically considering we see almost no animals in Cyberpunk. Diving into some of the lore of the game, we can see that most, if not all, of the wildlife in Night City is dying or has died out many decades before the game due to diseases. And on top of this, there are some lines from NPCs like Takamura about cats and dogs particularly being driven out of the cities and to death. So seeing a cat in the middle of a busy area is actually a very rare occurrence, if not totally unheard of. But it only gets more weird from here. You see, if you are able to stumble upon cat food in the open world and bring it back to right outside the dumpster of your main apartment, the exact same cat will spawn there shortly after. You are able to bring the cat to your apartment as a pet, and upon scanning him, you can see his name is Nibbles. But the weirdest part is all the places we see Nibbles elsewhere, particularly in many cutscenes with Johnny, like this one, where the cat apparently jumps to its death following Johnny, and many others, including the same cat years ago in flashbacks as Johnny Silverhand. And most eerily, in every single instance, no one else notices the cat. For such a rare animal, people should be more freaked out or excited, but no matter what, in every instance, the only people that see Nibbles are you and Johnny. And taking a look at Nibbles himself, we uncover even more. Nibbles is a specific breed of hairless cat called a Sphinx. And for those of you that don't know, the Sphinx is seen as a spiritual guardian in ancient Egyptian teachings that can guide humans to the afterlife. An interesting coincidence for sure. Either way, something sinister is happening here with Nibbles. Whether he is a ghost, demon, or guardian angel, this seemingly harmless cat is a lot more than just your pet. Cyberpunk has a lot of different endings to the game depending on what you choose to do at the very end. But in my opinion, the coolest ending, maybe not my favorite, but the coolest is for sure giving up your body to Johnny Silverhand and taking the fight to Arasaka with Rogue and the old crew. The mission takes you on a helicopter ride through Night City, and it has you blasting your way through Arasaka HQ. It's non-stop adrenaline fun. But something many players may have missed at the start of this ending is the implications as to what Rogue has been up to. When Johnny first confronted Rogue at the Afterlife bar asking for help, he brings up the question of how Rogue is doing so well in the first place. Everyone else in the old crew that originally was a part of planting that nuclear bomb in Arasaka Tower is either dead or wishing they were. All except for Rogue. And in this scene, it is heavily implied that may be for a reason. You see, earlier in the game, if you continue down Johnny's side quest line, at one point, in an attempt to find and kill Atom Smasher, you find instead an Arasaka agent, Grayson. And while you may not know Grayson, Rogue, who is with you, certainly does. And Grayson even remarks on how he finds it funny that they are not playing for the same team anymore. These two instances heavily imply that Rogue sold out to the corpo lifestyle after the fall of Johnny Silverhand, and explains perfectly how she was able to retain power and take over the afterlife and become one of the most well-known fixers in Night City. Especially considering Arasaka would have wanted her dead otherwise, her being able to walk free is quite peculiar. This likely means Rogue turned against Johnny after his death, and only after seeing him come back to life through V's body does she realize the error in her ways and begin to once again fight against the corpos. Even more damning though, some corpo gigs in the game show that Arasaka and other corporations were being fed information by a classified fixer helping them out. Could this fixer be Rogue? And if it is, just how much power and leverage has she given the corporations in Night City over the past decades? The more you dig into this mystery, the more you realize the person that Johnny held so close may have done more harm to his cause than anyone he knows. Something very hard to come to terms with. Another interesting contradiction you most likely missed on your first playthrough of Cyberpunk is Johnny Silverhand's mysterious and missing blood types. You see, in the game when you see Johnny's dog tags, it's clearly labeled as him having 0 NEG blood type. But in the Never Fade Away mission flashback to his life before, when he was being helped by a doctor after being brutally attacked, you can see his vitals on a screen next to Johnny's body. And those vitals read Johnny's blood type as AB-RHD+. This could be an analogy to the scene in the Pista Sophia, where Johnny gives V the dog tags of a soldier who saved him in war. The soldier's name was Robert John Linder, Johnny's birth name. That man had to die for the legend of Johnny Silverhand to be born. But with the implication that his blood type also changed, this theory gets a lot more interesting. As we know, in many wars, fighters would be captured and experimented on in the Cyberpunk universe, with rumors of some even mutating enemies into entirely new organisms. Could Robert John Linder have undergone more than just a metaphorical death? And could Johnny Silverhand actually be the product of a war crime experiment gone wrong, that warped a man's mind and biology into something completely different? Just when you thought Johnny's life couldn't get any more tragic, there seems to be some light implications that it could be even worse. And in the world of Cyberpunk, nothing is off the table. Cold Mirage is actually an easily accessible gig in Cyberpunk, but one that a lot of people miss since it's off the beaten path. The mission tasks you with opening a freezer at a set of hidden coordinates, and when you arrive, you stumble upon what looks to be the body of Raish Bartmoss. For those that don't know, Bartmoss is regarded in Cyberpunk as the legendary hacker who took down the original net in the universe to stop corpo and government control. A genius and eccentric man, Bartmoss believed cyberspace was the real world, and took on Netwatch in a never-ending battle of wits, as well as assisting Alt Cunningham against Arasaka on the dime of Militech. He believed aliens and conspiracy were at the center of politics, and fought to reveal the secrets of this to the world. So finding him dead in a freezer in the middle of a landfill is a big moment. After all, this is the most well-known hacker of all time. And as the story goes, Netwatch was able to finally shut him down and kill him in cryogenic stasis, something that seems to be confirmed when you find the body here. But after searching the freezer, you find an old cyberdeck you can bring back to Nix at the afterlife. And after he tries to hack into it, it actually fries his circuits and forces him to pass out, to which you have to save him. So what secrets is Bartmus hiding on his deck? And more importantly, when we were at the freezer and scanned the body, why did nothing come up? Is this really Raish Bartmus dead in the freezer? Or is this simply another game the famous genius is up to? Does he live in our real world to this day, or has his mind escaped to the net? It is implied in multiple data entries throughout the world of Cyberpunk that Bartmus lives on in one way or another, with multiple hackers on the dark net expressing concern that recent ICE and injection protocols showing up on the deep net resemble some of the old work of Bartmus. Either way, the legendary hacker in all of Cyberpunk's history most definitely has something else left up his sleeve. For our third tier, let's look into some of the scarier and less well-known theories in the Cyberpunk universe that could drastically change how we view the game. These theories are some of the more disturbing revelations, and if true, have some exponentially sad implications for Night City. For those that have traveled just south of Night City's interior, you surely have noticed this. It's a giant mass of greenhouses set up by Biotechnica that presumably is growing a majority of plant life and food to keep Night City afloat. What you might not know is Biotechnica is also known for animal cloning and creating lots of meats that we see in the game as well. And even more interestingly, they also have dabbed a lot in human cloning. Their human clone trials have proved partially unsuccessful so far though, as the clone bodies have no consciousness and are really just merely lifeless husks of meat, sometimes being implanted with low-level AI to give them life. So here comes the scary part. You see, Biotechnica is by no means a company that is good. Back in the 2000s, they helped many other corpos with black market deals, and now in present day, it is heavily implied that a lot of the food being produced in these greenhouses is in fact human. Scanning meat bags in the Maelstrom gang hideout from the All Food supplier, which gets its supply from the Biotechnica farms, you can see that 3.5% of the composition is unknown. What if that unknown material is actually human body parts? And we have more evidence too. Sector 4 of the Biotechnica flats, for example, is completely shut off and gated in, not allowing any players in. What could be so secret to be hiding in there? And on top of this, we also have multiple shards and gigs that lend credence to this theory as well. In the Biotechnica flats, for example, we can find a shard of an archived conversation between Tina Argon and Will Gunner, where they expand on details about black market proteins that no one really knows what is happening with them exactly. And also in the guinea pig gig, we learn about a Biotechnica executive who in her past experimented on many human beings that resulted in them dying, and more specifically, nomads. Now, if we come to the center of the Biotechnica flats, we can actually find a small nomad compound, and here we find a smoking gun, a massive gravesite with only a handful of NPCs left alive and rocking around, with many coming up to the graves and mourning throughout the day. In this town's small church, we can actually find a shard talking about how everything was fine, and then suddenly everyone started dying and disappearing. Using a little deductive reasoning, it isn't so far-fetched to assume Biotechnica may be up to something very dark here, kidnapping nomads that will not be traced back to anyone in the Badlands and using them for human cloning and meat production of human body parts that is eventually making its way into the Night City food supply. A damning proposition, for sure, if true. One of the biggest side plots in the Cyberpunk universe is about how many Night City residents are dealing with bouts of cyberpsychosis. Regina Jones even has an entire questline in the game dedicated to finding and dealing with these cyberpsychos, all in one effort to get more data on what is causing the outbursts. On the surface, it seems like it's simply individuals who have gone too far and augmented themselves to the point of madness, where they become more machine than man, and their body has extreme negative reaction to all the implants and drugs they're ingesting. But immediately off the bat, that makes us look to Maelstrom and wonder why so many of them lack cyberpsychosis. Some have gone insane for sure, but the vast majority we meet are just augmented bad guys that haven't completely lost their minds yet. If the theory about cyberpsychosis is correct, basically all of the guys in these gangs should be losing their minds. How are they able to be and form a coherent gang? Remember the cyberpsycho that attacked the mayor of Night City in River's questline? So if you investigate further into the dead mayor, you find that the cause of death was a spiked BD. Well, if V actually puts that spiked BD on and watches it, the sequence shares many visual effects with the paralysis. And for those that don't know, we will touch on the paralysis more in the next section. But essentially, they are being mind controlled remotely by shadow governments and people. This means that BD spikes causing cyberpsychosis are resulting in the same odd outcomes as people being mind controlled. Meaning maybe all the cyberpsychosis is actually a lot more concerning. It might not be people going crazy with Chrome after all, but instead, people's augmented minds are being remotely taken over. In fact, in Judy's side job, talking about her revolution, Judy even remarks that her doll takeover chip that will enhance the dolls into fighters will make them feel like they are going through a cyberpsychosis episode. There are a lot of heavy implications throughout the Cyberpunk story that there is a lot more than meets the eye with cyberpsychosis, and that many of the people may actually be mind-controlled zombies, not just sad stories. Dotted all around Night City are many weird statues varying in size of a weird frog-like creature with 4 arms and a sword. On first glance, it's semi-amusing and maybe points to Buddhist temples or some sort of deity that some of the Night City residents worship. But if we go to one of the biggest statues in the Corpo Plaza, we see this code in big lettering right on the statue, FF06B5. For anyone that doesn't know, this is the hex color code for magenta, and in fact, we can even find a magenta version of this statue in Japantown and across Night City, and this time with legs and a Buddhist monk's figurine with robes on. Which is a very interesting coincidence, considering this frog-like creature very closely also resembles Hindu and Buddhist gods, with multiple arms and the sitting stance. Specifically, Mangala, the god of Mars. And as we know, in Cyberpunk, Mars is a big fight for contention. We also find monks meditating in front of these statues at times. And all in all, this implies that something is going on with these statues and religious undertones, and with Mars. And in fact, later on in this video, we'll tie it all together in our final tier. But even more damning, we actually see these statues around many important shadow characters in the game as well. That further implies there's some sort of broader connection between the statues and a grand conspiracy in Cyberpunk. A lot of people have probably gone through Panam's quest for reasons. And one part of the quest line actually takes you through a small underground cave in the Badlands. And it's a pretty cool section, especially because it's the only time in the game we really get to go in underground caves like this, barring the Pan-Am ending as well. What a lot of people don't know, though, is that in the game's files, and with modding and console commands, it's actually possible to find a pretty extensive network of unfinished and unpolished underground sections right beneath Night City. These sections are dark, damp, and devoid of any content, but they are there, and they certainly seem like they were intended for something at some point. In fact, during some of the radio station's commentaries throughout the game, there's one moment where we hear rumors of corrupted Corpo vampires living underground in extensive cave systems throughout Night City. This sounds absolutely absurd at first glance, but it gets extremely interesting when we look back to one of the earliest leaks of Cyberpunk 2077 by a previously disgruntled employee. The developer noted a lot of things about the game and its progress that at the time were hated in the community, but turned out to be true upon release. And most interestingly, he noted one big piece of cut content the game was originally intended to have was an underground network of sewers and caves that was home to an army of vampire-like creatures similar to the vampires in the Masquerade Bloodline series. When we put all this evidence together, it starts to become very clear that this network of unused tunnels for sure was originally intended to house something. And that something is most likely an army of corpo vampires that kidnap and kill people to harness their strength. It's a pretty out there theory, but based on what we know about Cyberpunk and weird theories, it would fit right in. Maximum Mike and Gary the Prophet are the two most prolific conspiracy theorists in the game, and naturally, because of this, they have to make it onto my list. Mike is a man you always hear on the radio talking about crazy conspiracies and corpo wrongdoings, and Gary is the Co-Carnage lookalike right outside Victor and Misty's clinics, shouting about aliens nonstop. But the crazy thing is, what if they weren't so crazy after all? Throughout his quest, Gary screams to the public, letting them know that giant humanoid lizard alien monster men are taking over the net and coming into our world to take control of everything. You see, although Gary's questline can end in multiple ways, the most interesting for sure is the final one where he is kidnapped and his disciple takes his place. When questioned, the disciple notes that Gary was kidnapped by men in suits with blue eyes and taken to the mothership. This gets even more weird as we can actually see men like this throughout the game, even donning a specific ring on their finger that seems to denote that they are part of some shadow organization. Maximum Mike also alludes to this on some of his radio chatter about interdimensional beings that have taken over the net and are hell-bent on controlling the world. So what originally sounds like crazy nonsense from a detained man on the streets and on the radio slowly unfolds into something much deeper. We know from some shards in the game that there has been probes sent into space with the explicit intention of having aliens connect to our net in the Cyberpunk universe. And even some speculation in these data banks that aliens may have already found us. Even more convincing, Bartmoss, who we talked about before, had a book that he made about himself. And in that book, he talked about how aliens were likely already a part of the net. And as one of the most genius hackers of all time, if you had to take someone's word for it, it would be his. But if Mike and Gary's sermons are actually true, this would mean that interdimensional lizard aliens are more than just funny Alex Jones-like theories, and actually a part of by far the biggest conspiracy in Cyberpunk 2077. One that will likely play out in future DLC and hopefully lends credence to the idea that there are things much scarier than corporations in cyberspace. But let's tie that all together in our last section. And finally, for our last tier, we will dive into the craziest and most demented theories on our iceberg. The conspiracies that could change this game fundamentally as we know it, and unravel some of the most disturbing things Cyberpunk and the CDPR community has to offer. Many people remember the building where Arasaka attacks Hanako and Takamura, potentially taking Takamura's life based on the player's actions. But for most players, they probably missed the much more interesting part of this building. You see, if you make your way upstairs in this seemingly run-down and nonchalant building, you eventually may stumble upon a partially opened door, that being room 301. When you first walk up, you notice a large blue light glow emitting from the room, and upon closer inspection and peering through the small crack in the door, you see what looks to be scribbles all over the walls. Unfortunately, there is no way to get into this room besides glitching through the door, but if you manage to do so, you are met with a haunting scene. The walls are littered with incoherent writings and shapes, and on the ground in the center of the room is a wrench with blood drenched around it. A large heap of file holders are held up in the corner of the room, and right on the center of the back wall, in giant lettering, is the phrase, "I am not me," with ink and potentially blood splattered everywhere. Something truly haunting has happened in this room, and some other users online have even reported hearing faint screams when near here, as well as the sounds of shattering glass. It's unclear if this was cut content from maybe a quest involving River or Cyberpsycho, or just an Easter egg from the devs. But either way, it's something beyond horrific that has happened in this room, and the building that contains it. Even more creepily is the significance of the number 301. You see, in many religious sects, the number 301 signifies the coming of a hellish angel, and further parallels to our own life can be drawn to organizations like Cicada 3301, which famously created well-known cryptography puzzles online for recruiting the smartest minds of our generation, only to disappear later without even giving people an idea of who they were. In terms of places in Cyberpunk 2077 that likely have more than meets the eye, Room 301 is certainly a place of such intrigue. One of the lesser-known series of missions in Cyberpunk is the Imagine gigs with a Buddhist Zen master. You originally stumble upon this questline if you were walking through the downtown Corpo Plaza area, and more specifically in the gardens. Here you will find a Zen master who asks you for some money to take you on a spiritual journey, as he has seen something in you. If you accept, you're transported into a foreign jungle, the likes of which you see nowhere else in the game for the most part, and this series continues with you meeting this mysterious monk in many locations across the world, hearing his words of wisdom, and having your mind be transported to unknown locations in nature, each time with the monk disappearing when you come back to your senses. It's a nice change of pace from the chaos of the rest of the game, but it's also harboring some very significant ramifications. A big part of the Cyberpunk main story is about the idea of human souls and what it means to be human, about whether copying ourselves into new bodies is really us or some new sort of monstrosity. And the ending of this questline specifically has some big answers for us. You see, upon completing the last meetup with this monk, he once again disappears into oblivion. But this time, Johnny is now next to us, sitting and looking into the distance. When confronted about his thoughts on the monk and his visions, Johnny questions what you are even talking about, and it quickly becomes clear that he has not been seeing what you have. The reason this is so significant is this is the only time in the entire game where you and Johnny had this sort of cognitive dissonance. Through every fight and every cutscene, Johnny is with you along the way, and it is only on the journeys with this monk that he seems to remember nothing. These journeys through your soul. Sitting next to Johnny after the monk disappears are two objects, a Buddhist altar trinket and a small shard. The shard tells the story of a man telling his grandson the story of the Tower of Babel, which, for those of you who don't know, is a story of humankind building a tower to try and reach heaven to avoid persecution, which resulted in God creating multiple languages to spite them. And in this shard, the man tells his grandson about the different religions and atheism, and how they all wanted to answer one burning question: do we have a soul or not? It is strongly implied through this entire quest that at least in Cyberpunk, we do have a soul, and that even a crazy terrorist man stuck in your head cannot take that away from you, and that maybe what these monks across the game world are studying is how to tap into our souls in a world that has become so soulless. This also would have implications for the ending and story beats of Cyberpunk, as it would confirm that those transferring their mind and body to new hosts and living on will still have lost what made them human, the soul. In fact, in one of Maximum Mike's radio discussions, he mentions that this monk master may just be Bartmoss wandering around in a new body, helping to offer guidance to lost souls, as we know others like Missy have seen this man from logs on her computer as well. The Peralez storyline in Cyberpunk is a personal favorite for many in the community. You originally receive a call from Elizabeth, a woman asking for help, and upon meeting with her and her husband Jefferson in person, you come to the realization that they are in grave danger. And because Jefferson is running to be mayor, it's important that you get to the bottom of it quickly. You see, recently Jefferson awoke in the middle of the night and heard people inside his penthouse. He got his gun and tried to look around, but was immediately knocked out and doesn't remember anything else. Elizabeth thinks her husband is being paranoid and wants to help, but Jefferson is sure something is up. And as you snoop around their house, it is slowly unraveled that they have been monitored this entire time by a corporation they are now paying to protect them, SSRI, a lesser known and new protection firm, similar to Night Corp. Hidden away in the middle of the Peralez's home is a secret monitoring facility where SSRI has been watching every move the Peralez's have been making. Someone is after them, and in an attempt to figure out who, you track down a van nearby that is sending a signal to the house. And when you get there, after clearing out a group of unknown bad guys, you hack into the van and discover that this unknown group is actually in the process of mind controlling the Peralez's. The reason they have been forgetting things and not feeling like themselves is because programs are being executed on their local chips to slowly transform them into puppets. You let Elizabeth know, and Jefferson, depending on what you choose to do, and the quest ends there, with a mysterious figure warning you over a call to stop looking into what you have discovered. But you see, at the end of the quest line, you also may notice a man off in the distance staring at you. A man the Cyberpunk community affectionately calls Mr. Blue Eyes. This man has been watching you throughout the entire quest line from different vantage points, and upon finding him at the end, he vanishes out of thin air. But we learn something about him from that short glimpse we get. Sitting on his finger is a ring that seems harmless at first. However, upon closer inspection, it becomes clear we have seen this ring before in many places. In fact, in some of the stories on this list before. Characters like Gary the Prophet, the monks praying to the magenta statue, and some higher level and shady characters we come across throughout the entire game. Furthermore, in one of the endings of the game, we actually get to meet Mr. Blue Eyes, and he tasks us with going to the Crystal Palace in space on a death mission, where the game abruptly ends as you float towards the structure. This man is clearly in the know about many things, and has friends in many high places and power we are not yet aware of. And the connections between the conspiracies of Cyberpunk and this blue-eyed man start to paint a picture that there may be something more going on in this universe. As stated before, Gary the Prophet and the magenta statues with the monks praying to them are all pointing to some sort of alien conspiracy on the net, or even Bartmoss, who is alluded to as having a golden ring of similar sorts to the blue-eyed man in one shard, claims aliens have taken over. Could this blue-eyed man, and all those with these rings of power praying to these mysterious statues, somehow be connected? Is there a conspiracy going on so grand in Cyberpunk that the entire future of the franchise could be dependent on it? It seems every important character is connected to this mystery somehow, and we may have some clues as to how when investigating the game's files for Mr. Blue Eyes. You see, his undershirt is actually referenced in the game files as man_average_Q115_blackhand_D. The reason this is so interesting is because Morgan Blackhand is a main character from the original Cyberpunk tabletop lore, who took place in the Arasaka nuclear bombing with Johnny Silverhand decades ago. But in the game, we never meet him. Could Blackhand somehow be a part of this ultimate alien conspiracy, mind control takeover of the net that will result in the complete annihilation of the human race as we know it? Potentially a story for a future Cyberpunk game or DLC. Another quick addition to this overall conspiracy is how Night Corp may be involved as well, and is likely the main antagonist in a future Cyberpunk sequel. Throughout the game, on multiple shards we can crack the security and discover that Night Corp is using beaming tech on users' brains to install new personalities, and that they've also created a small and now becoming large drone army to work as docile helpers. We know from talking with the Voodoo Boys that the net is not as secure as it is being made out to be, and many rogue AI could potentially be taken advantage of to cause massive damage. And everything we can tell from Night Corp is that they are trying to take advantage of this. So could Night Corp be planning to win an all-out corpo war by controlling the minds of innocent civilians and using a supposedly docile drone army to overpower adversaries? We'll just have to wait and find out in future games. And that's everything to the iceberg. Well, except one last thing. Because you see, the real biggest conspiracy theory about Cyberpunk isn't something within the game itself. It's how such an extraordinary product like this, with so much depth and love put into it, could fail so hard. On one hand, it makes sense. We were lied to, and this game on release was a disaster the likes of which we rarely see. But that's just it. Is that really the case? You see, for many people, they never played Cyberpunk, or barely did at all, or are only now getting into it. And their impressions of the release of this game as a whole have been made from the hordes of commentators damning it upon its inception. But you see, I've always loved this game. I was hyped for it from the beginning. I watched every press release, absorbed every interview, and played the game on every single console and PC on release, and up until today. The story you have been told about this game is a complete lie. And funnily enough, the biggest conspiracy about Cyberpunk isn't some mystery in the game, but one outside of it. And how an entire industry was tricked into thinking one of the greatest games of all time was actually a flop. And how a game that was much better than people thought, even upon release, was dragged through the mud. But you see, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, the kind that deserve its own video and own analysis. And so that's exactly what I plan on doing. And as always, thanks for watching.